The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning for the LifeLong Links webinar series. This morning we're doing Disability and Etiquette and ADA 101. My name is Nicole Seedorf, and I'm the training specialist for the Iowa Department on Aging. I have just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. We're recording the webinar this morning, and it will be available on our website at iowaaging.gov. And we have opened the webinar with everyone on mute. If you have any questions, please type them in as we go, and we will be addressing the questions at the end of the presentation. Our speakers today are Joe Sample and Ruth Thompson. And thank you again for joining us, and I'm now going to turn it over to them.
Thank you, Nicole. Again, this is Joe Sample, and really appreciate having you all on the line today. In the event that there's clanging in the background, our office is under construction, so we apologize if there's any background noise that comes through on the phone. Today we do want to talk a little bit about disability etiquette and ADA 101, and I'm going to have Ruth introduce herself, and then we'll get started.
Hi, for those of you who don't know me, I am the new program manager for LifeLong Links Aging and Disability Resource Center, and I've been around for about a year. And although I started kind of this part of my career at a state unit on aging in another state, I've always kind of been the disability person. Even in the aging world, I was always the disability liaison from our department in almost everything that we did. I've kind of ventured from that a little bit and did some health and housing, community development, but always concentrating on disability. And the job that I had before I came here was as the executive director of a disability advocacy organization. I've done this presentation in different incarnations so many times that I could do it kind of off the cuff, which is unusual for me. So I'm just kind of really happy to be able to share what I know about disability and to help you as you begin to serve a more broad population than you have to develop a greater level of comfort and understanding. Joe?
Yeah, and I too have had the opportunity to work in a number of capacities working in the disability community. I started off at Easter Seals and focused primarily in the employment world with job coaching, job consulting, as well as providing ADA trainings. Back in the day when I started it, that's when the ADA was just starting, and so employers had a lot of confusion about what it was and how to implement. So hopefully today we'll be able to share nuggets even from all the way back from that time that may be useful to you in your work today. I also have the privilege of serving on behalf of the department on the statewide Independent Living Council, on the Developmental Disabilities Council, the Mental Health Planning and Policy Council, and also on the Independent Living Commission for the Department for the Blind, as well as serving on the Olmstead Committee the Olmstead Task Force for Iowa. So have had an opportunity to intermingle with policy and service delivery in the disability community. So what we will do today is we're going to walk through this presentation and hope to accomplish these objectives: to increase the understanding and comfort of interacting with persons with disabilities, and to increase basic knowledge of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And along this presentation, we're going to start with the etiquette component. Ruth will take the lead on that, and then I'll take some of the lead on the ADA discussion. And what we hope to do is to intermingle some experiential stories that she and I have had in these worlds. So with that, I will turn it back to Ruth.
Okay. So I think it's important, we tend to categorize people. I think it's important not to think of people so much, not to define people by labels. And throughout my work, it's just natural that I've acquired a number of people who I consider my closest personal friends who are people with disabilities. And their disability is the least interesting thing about them. They're just people like everyone else. I think it's natural to have a level of discomfort around people with disabilities if you haven't had that kind of exposure. But just, be natural and treat people as you would anybody, regardless of disability. Don't be afraid to make a mistake when you're meeting and communicating with someone with a disability. I think that if you reach out to someone with kindness and with good intention, they'll overlook if you stumble a bit. Something that's important to remember is to be age appropriate. It's often you often see people who perhaps with intellectual or developmental disability be put into a childlike role or to be treated as children, but you should always address people by their physical age. Whenever you approach a group, when you're in a group with people, if the setting is formal enough that you're addressing people as Mr. Smith and Miss Thompson and Mr. Sample, then don't turn to the person with disability and call them Billy. You know, treat people with disabilities the same. It doesn't seem as though you should have to say this, but I can't tell you how many times I've had it relayed to me. Don't ever patronize people by patting them on the head or shoulder. And again, that kind of puts them in a childlike role that is not natural, and it's not very respectful. You know, just kind of relax. I know that I'm telling you all the things not to do, but this is just to create awareness. If you don't know what to do, kind of follow the lead of the person and allow them to put you at ease. We all are in the social services field. We see ourselves as helpers. If you see someone who seems to need assistance, offer assistance, but if they decline it, don't insist. If it's accepted, ask, you know, well, what can I do for you? You know, what would you like for me to do? And follow their directions. Don't take over the situation. If you're addressing someone, interacting with someone with a disability who's with another person, speak to that person rather than speaking through another person. Ask what would you like instead of saying to whoever's with them, what would they like. Interact with the person with the disability if that's who the conversation is directed toward or about. So a lot of times you hear, you know, news and just in language, people will say, you know, this man is wheelchair bound or confined to a wheelchair. If you see somebody who really is confined or bound to a wheelchair, please untie them. Wheelchairs are not limiting. Wheelchairs and other devices are tools to make a person more independent, not to confine them. It's important not to make assumptions about what a person can or cannot do. Again, going back to that, we're all caring and helping people, but don't assume that people have limitations that they may not have. If you're speaking with a person who uses a wheelchair for more than just a few minutes, try to find yourself a seat to make yourself at eye level. One of my friends who uses a chair told me that the most unpleasant thing about being in a chair is the view, because you're always at butt level with everyone around you. So if you're going to be in contact for a while, have a seat and make eye contact. Also, don't touch or lean on a person's wheelchair without their permission. It's an extension of their person. So just like you wouldn't, lean on somebody's shoulder, you wouldn't lean on their wheelchair. Also, don't take control of the wheelchair or try to push someone if they haven't asked you for that. So thinking about visual disability, whenever you are approaching a person who is blind, let them know that you're there, identify yourself, and don't assume that they know who you are by your voice. Face the person and speak directly to him or her and use a normal tone of voice. Visual disability does not include hearing disability, but I can't tell you how many times you see someone going up to a person who's blind and shouting at them. They don't come hand in hand. Also, don't leave a conversation without letting the person know that you're leaving. I used to work for a person who was blind, and he told me that nothing would make him madder than to have somebody walk away from him and him not realize it, because he would be standing there talking to air, and it just made him look foolish and made him feel foolish. If you're offering directions, be as specific as possible and make the person aware of obstacles in the path of travel. So, if there's a trip hazard or there's a bench sticking out, let them be aware of that. And also, an easy way to give someone verbal cues is to use clock cues. So say the door is at 2 o'clock or the table is at 9 o'clock. And generally, a person who's blind, even though they may have always been blind, will have a sense of those clock cues.
There was a gentleman in our offices just last week who was visually impaired, and he was in our reception area and went to sit down. And the way that the chairs in our office are set up, there's a chair, a table, and a chair that sit right beside each other. Well, without some sort of cue to let him know that there was a table in between, his first seat was on the table. And so that was a learning opportunity for me to realize that, we need to continue to do an improved job of persons with visual impairment to make sure that they are given a cue, especially with the chair. Chairs on your left, a table in the middle, a chair on your right, so that they know where exactly to gauge how to seat.
So if you're walking or with a person who's blind or visually impaired, and you come upon posted information, be courteous and let them know. If it's something, certainly don't read ridiculous things to them, but if it's something, information that they need to know, make sure that they're aware of it. So you should never interact in any way with a guide dog or any kind of service animal unless the owner has given you permission. Particularly those big old goofy yellow labs are the cuddliest, most gorgeous animals in the world, and that's typically what you see as a guide dog. But if they've got that harness on, they're working, and sometimes the work that they do is life-saving and very, very serious work. And so never ever interfere with a guide dog unless the owner is giving you permission to. Again, you can offer assistance if it seems needed, but if it's declined, don't insist. And if the offer is accepted, ask the person how you can best help. So hearing disability is interesting. The deaf community is one of the few communities who, we'll talk a little bit later about people first. And people who are deaf, they don't want to be called people who are deaf. They want to be called, they're deaf. And they own it, and they're proud of it. And so it's and interestingly enough, they don't even consider themselves as people with, and I'm speaking in generalities, that by and large, they don't even consider deafness as a disability. It just is who they are and a state of their being. So that's one population that kind of takes a different approach to disability. So if you're working with someone who's deaf or hard of hearing, ask the person how he or she prefers to communicate. And that might be through writing notes, lip reading, or they might need an interpreter. And there are two kinds of commonly used interpreters. One of them is a sign language interpreter that you've all seen, and the other is a CART transcriptionist. And it's kind of the same function as a court reporter, but a CART transcriptionist will type on the very same machine that a court reporter uses, but the words are projected on a screen. And that's particularly helpful in a large room. So even people who, I find myself, if I'm in a room where there's a CART interpreter, I use it. It's easier for me to follow along. If you're speaking through an interpreter, remember that the interpreter may lag a few words behind. I am the worst. I worked a lot with both CART and ASL translators, and they would always be mad at me because I'm a fast talker, and they would always be signaling me to slow down, and that's just something hard if that's your speech pattern, but you have to be mindful of that. Particularly hard to interpret are names, numbers, or technical things. Those all have to be finger-spelled, and they take a lot longer. And you should pause occasionally to let the translator do their job completely and accurately. Again, talk directly to the person who is deaf or hard of hearing. Before you speak, make sure that you have their attention so that they know that they're being spoken to. You can wave at them or gesture somehow, or tap them on the shoulder or something to let them know that you're speaking to them. Speak in a clear, expressive manner. Don't over-enunciate or exaggerate your words unless they ask you to. Don't raise your voice. If someone is deaf, no matter how loud you yell, they're not going to hear you. A little bit different if somebody's just hard of hearing. But speak in a normal tone. Don't shout. It's really important to facilitate lip reading. One of my daughter's best friend's mother is deaf, and she was such a good lip reader that I knew her for 2 years before I knew that she was deaf. As a matter of fact, I found out that she was deaf when we went through a McDonald's drive-thru together, and that was just about one of the funniest experiences I've ever had in my life. But so if someone is lip reading, you need to face into the light, or at least so the light's not shining in their eyes. Keep your hands and objects away from your mouth. Make good direct eye contact. with them so that they can easily lip read. If someone needs you to write messages to them, don't talk and do that at the same time, because it's natural for them to try to lip read and read what you're writing at the same time, and it just makes communication more difficult, even though you're trying to facilitate communication. If you don't understand something that's said, ask the person to repeat it or write it down. If someone has never heard, sometimes their speech is difficult to understand because they don't know what speech is supposed to sound like. So ask them to repeat themselves or to write it down. The point is about communication, not about being polite or not hurting their feelings, and they will be happy that you're interested in what they have to say and are trying to understand. Don't pretend to understand if you don't. If you know any sign language, try using it. Even if you don't think you're very good, it'll make you better, and it will make you demonstrate that you care enough about them to try to communicate in what is their first language.
One quick note on hearing impairment. Beyond a person who's completely deaf, those who are hard of hearing, especially as we age, we lose some facility related to hearing. So speaking clearly, enunciating, slowing down the language, and actually lowering your voice to a deeper voice helps a lot to get. So a lot of times women with higher voices are harder to hear, at least in the harder of hearing population and those who are aging. So trying to lower your voice to a deeper tone oftentimes helps that communication.
Right. Okay. So speech disability, as I mentioned before, sometimes, although it's not a disability, speech issues can come with deafness, or other disability might impact a person's ability to speak clearly. Or they may just have a funny accent like I do. So talk with people with speech disabilities as you would talk with anyone else. Just because they have a speech disability, you shouldn't be afraid to start a conversation with them. Just be patient and give them the time to answer. Don't kind of interrupt them and try to answer their sentences, finish their sentences for them. And don't get distracted. Give them your undivided attention while they're trying to communicate with you. Speak in your regular tone of voice. Again, you don't have to shout. You don't have to kind of dumb your words down, for lack of a better. And keep in mind that a speech disability doesn't in any way indicate that there's any kind of an intellectual disability. Again, if you don't understand what the person said, ask them to repeat themselves. Ask them to spell it or tell you in a different way. Write it down. If there's a situation where you need to obtain information quickly, ask short questions that can be answered in yes or no, or brief answers, or with a nod. But don't fall back on that as the only way to communicate with people with a speech disability. They want to communicate just like we do, and that kind of interaction is important to all of us. And we're not going to talk a whole lot about assistive technology now. We'll go into that later on perhaps in another webinar. I think we did a webinar with Compass earlier on about assistive technology. But things like iPads and iPhones and other types of technology that we all use have made life a whole lot easier, have made communication a whole lot easier for people who have speech disabilities. So be aware that there are resources out there.
And during the Olmsted Task Force, there's a member who does have a speech disability, and when it becomes difficult to understand what she's attempting to communicate, she will type in to her device that then translates and speaks on her behalf. And it's just a matter of giving her enough space and time to state what her thoughts are. So be patient in those moments, and the technology has been golden for her to be able to be liberated in speaking.
Okay, so intellectual disability, and this is also developmental disability. You hear those kind of terms used together or interchangeably. So again, treat adults who have cognitive abilities as adults. Be age appropriate. When speaking with someone who has a cognitive disability, kind of watch their body language and be alert to their responses so that you can adjust your method of communication if you need to. You can look at their cues to see if they're understanding you or if something isn't working out. Use language that's concrete rather than abstract. Be specific without being too simplistic or patronizing. People who have auditory perceptual problems may need to have directions repeated, and this is actually also true of people with brain injury, and may take notes to help them remember directions or sequence of tasks. I actually am a huge note taker.
And in the employment environment, the sequence of tasks for some consumers have been even pictures. Mm-hmm. So giving a flip, putting it on like a little keychain, and with pictures that they can flip through as they're doing their work helps to orient them to a sequence of time. So, and this, of course, is not universal. It's very individualized. But for some consumers that I worked with intellectual disabilities, that was a simple adaptation to the work environment that made their lives easier and helped them stay on the job, in fact. So keep, something simple like that to help. How do you keep track of a sequence of time through pictures is a useful tool.
Right. And so this next point about sensory overload, that really isn't entirely about disability. I mean, I think that people just process information differently. So people who have perceptual or sensory overload problems can get overwhelmed or confused or disoriented if there's too much information thrown at them at once. So in that situation, you would provide information gradually and clearly and reduce background noise if possible. And we were just talking about this yesterday. I'm kind of somebody who, when I'm on a roll, I process information kind of rapid fire and it comes out my mouth just as quickly as I process it. And my husband is someone who has to slow things down and think about them more. And when we get into that kind of pattern, I can see him shutting down because I've just thrown too much at him and I just need to back off and let him think about what I've said for a minute. So that doesn't even have anything much to do about intellectual disability. That's just about the way that people process information. That said, though, if it's clear to you that someone's not understanding what you're saying, think about repeating the information using different wording or different communication approaches. Maybe use examples of something that's concrete or tangible to help facilitate that communication. And also, again, allow time for the information to be fully understood. Don't become impatient if you have to repeat yourself. And I'm going to say this over and over again. If you don't understand what's being said to you, don't pretend that you do. Ask a person to repeat themselves or to explain. People may respond slowly, so give them time. Be patient, be flexible, and supportive. People respond to kindness, and if they understand that you want to help them, they'll respond in kind. Some people who have cognitive disability may be easily distracted. You shouldn't think that they're being rude or that they aren't interested. It's just the way that they handle, just the way they process. So instead, just try to redirect them politely back to whatever it is that you need them to focus on. And again, this is something that doesn't have much of anything to do with disability. Don't expect all people to be able to read well. Some people may not read at all. And, it's hard to imagine in this day and time, but illiteracy is still a huge issue. And so that doesn't even have to do with disability. So keep in mind that if someone appears to have difficulty in reading, you might have to have an accommodation, like, as Joe said, something with pictures perhaps, or read to them if they're comfortable with that. So traumatic brain injury is something that is getting a whole lot of attention. We've been in a war now for, what, 12 years, 14 years, for a very, very long time, and we're seeing a lot of veterans coming back with brain injury, and now a lot of athletes are being identified as having brain injury. And a lot of us are engaging in more risky recreational activities, than extreme sports and four-wheeling and all sorts of things that make us more prone to greater incidence of traumatic brain injury. Some brain injury, though, is the outcome of other things, such as stroke or the way that the progression of multiple sclerosis, epilepsy can cause traumatic brain injury. So people with brain injuries may have short-term memory deficits and might repeat themselves or require information to be repeated, and those are folks who often are big note takers as well. You might notice a personality difference in someone with a brain injury. And something that's important to remember is that brain injury is an unseen disability. A lot of the disabilities that we talked about today are not always visible immediately. Although we're not here to diagnose people, if someone is behaving in a way that doesn't seem, quite on point, it might be that they have a traumatic brain injury. And the disability, it's a very individualized disability. People experience it in very different ways, and recovery is different for each person.
And I think it's also important to note, too, that there's like a spectrum of brain injury. I mean, some very significant injuries, even though they're significant trauma to the brain, they may not seem as significant. For example, concussions are getting a lot of attention in sports in particular, from mild to significant concussions. But even though there's a scale associated with that concussion, it's still considered a traumatic brain injury, and there's a lot of attention in sports. I know that the National Football League has taken on an initiative related to traumatic brain injury. And of course, in Iowa, there are newer laws in the sporting events, and a discussion probably in the next General Assembly will be around expanding the language of how we address sports injuries in Iowa. So you'll continue to see this grow in terms of conversation and policy and supports. And again, it is a very individualized disability with different recovery for different injuries for every person.
So mental health is something that, in having served people in having served older Iowans, we see kind of Alzheimer's and dementia, those types of mental health issues, and depression, I think, is widely seen in people as they age. But we're going to be looking to serve different populations, and might perhaps be seeing different types of mental health issues than we've seen before.
And so I'm going to walk through this slide a little bit, in that it's important to just, with all the media, start from the vantage point that you should never presume that a person with a mental illness or mental health situation is dangerous. That's just simply not true across the spectrum. Persons with lived experience is oftentimes the more recent way of describing a person with mental illness. They have a lived experience associated with the mental illness that they have. And it's also widely varied and individualized. There's acute and episodic mental health needs, and then there's non-acute needs where the mental health illness is managed through medication, through behavioral management. So it really kind of depends on the state of the episode for that consumer as to how one might need to navigate her and assist her with whatever is taking place. Some of the non-drug interactions that can take place when episodic activity is occurring is maintain a calm demeanor, maintain a metered speech, and it's important to avoid touch during those times, because that could be a sensory thing that may spark a response. Attempt a distraction towards a routine activity. So if somebody is experiencing an episodic mental health situation, distracting towards something more mundane, such as referring to the weather or something that they are wanting to accomplish that day. So how can I help you with the drywall today? I mean, whatever it is that they're actually working on to help them move towards to something that's stable in their in their situation at that time. Obviously, if their acute condition continues or their episodic condition continues to grow, certainly you need to seek expert support where indicated. And it's important to note that there is in Iowa some mental health first aid training available, so that if you're unsure or uncomfortable with how to help support persons with mental health or with lived experience, during a mental health situation, the mental health first aid training is a nice way to kind of familiarize yourself and be better prepared for dealing with persons who might be in an episodic state. And I want to, one of my favorite mugs that I have from the National Association of Mental Illness is a list of people who have enriched our lives who have mental illness of some sort, everything from depression to schizophrenia. And so what you see on the right-hand side is just a list of people that you probably have heard of who have been diagnosed or assessed to have had some sort of mental health need in their lives. And so, I mean, Buzz Aldrin, you know, an astronaut, all the way to writers, to artists, to presidents. So it's not, and it's not always a seen condition. It can be an invisible disability, but it's not really a scary disability. It's something that as you work with people with mental illness and who have lived experiences, you'll be able to work and navigate with them based on what they help you to understand about their specific illness. And so, so these next couple slides are really just trying to help you find ways of what to say, what not to say. The key to almost all of this is person-first language. So, so focus on. So this is why you hear people with disabilities or consumers with disabilities, a person who has a certain diagnosis or has a certain disability versus identifying them as the disabled. So. He's quadriplegic, for example, or he's crippled. By the way, crippled is a very outdated word. And I'm going to tell you the biggest pet peeve word I have is invalid. If you break that word down, it's invalid. And it should never be used in any kind of discussion when you're referring to persons with disabilities. And handicapped is a golf term versus what we really should be using in referring to persons with disabilities. So it's also an outdated term. So people with disabilities, people-first language is extremely important. And when you talk about wheelchair use, really focus on the person who uses a wheelchair. You can also shift that language around, for example, a wheelchair user that's still putting the emphasis on the person versus the disability versus what they are using as a mobility device. And so the rest of these slides, yeah, so those two slides are really just trying to help you with different types of person-first language. I'd like to pause just to see if there are any questions that have been typed in before we move forward to the next section. Okay. So we don't see any that's been typed in, so just remember if you do have questions or comments that you want to share, to go ahead and type those into the box on your screen. We're going to open the next section with a 3-minute video that kind of helps set the stage for the Americans with Disabilities Act. So we'll just take a pause here for a second to get that set up.
Caption.
See a bunch of disabled people falling up steps. My feeling on it was pretty good. Touching the street disabled people.
We all have to
So why not let them see night before, just all these ideas going through my head. You know, like all the years of fighting for civil rights, all the meetings, and it was this big moment where I was going to be able to release all this energy by crawling up these steps. I probably about the same way I am now, you know, so I'm not in that great shape. There's 100 steps, you know. And there was this little girl who was right ahead of me. And I said, oh my gosh, this little girl is going to, she has cerebral palsy. This little girl is going to climb the steps ahead of me, and I'm not going to be able to make it. She's going to make me look really stupid. So of course the cameras were on her, but they were on me right below her, so I couldn't stop, you know. In fact, several senators were furious because look at those folks. They're obstructing. They're in our way. They're making fools of themselves. And that's because it inconvenienced these senators. And you know what? This was the way our people lived every day.
So we're hopeful that you could hear that. If not, it was closed captioned. But the link is within the slides. It'll be made available to you if you want to go back and see it again or share it with other folks. But it's a really nice video to help explain the civil rights movement around the Americans with Disabilities Act that was signed into law in 1990. In fact, we just, within the last weekend, celebrated its 24th year. My math obviously is down. But its 24th year of existence. And here locally, Senator Harkin, who really was the lead author and instrumental in getting that civil rights movement through and that act through Congress, was back in Des Moines. We had at the Harkin Institute, it was a great audience, and we had him, Governor Branstad, and there was another gentleman from Congress whose name escapes me, another gentleman who was part of the African American civil rights movement before the ADA was enacted, and as well as Ms. Wheelchair Iowa of 2014. And so anyway, there were a number of leaders who were talking about the ADA and how it was implemented and how difficult it was. And this sentinel moment, this moment where it got the senators and the public's attention, was when all of these folks climbed the Capitol steps, an inaccessible building of government, that they have a right to vote for their leadership, that they have a right to access their government, could not literally physically get in the door. And so it was an extremely important moment in time, and the media was able to get the attention of the public, and it swayed. And in 1990, Americans with Disabilities Act was signed by by President George Bush. And within the elements of the ADA, you have the bullet points there, but employment, access to state and local government, public accommodations, commercial facilities, and transportation were really the key elements of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And in the Olmstead decision of 1999, it was a Supreme Court hearing to challenge an inability of a person to have access to public facility. The Supreme Court affirmed that the Americans with Disabilities Act is to be supported in full by the United States and by its citizenry. Okay, so I'm going to just touch on these specific key points then. Employment, A lot of you have probably had at least some exposure to this, but in short, it's creating a reasonable accommodation. And a reasonable accommodation does not mean that you have to tear down an entire building and build a new building or completely knock out walls. That may not be reasonable based on where that consumer or that employee is employed. A reasonable accommodation can be very simple and inexpensive. I gave the example earlier of a flip card that the person with the intellectual disability, he walked through Home Depot, in fact, looking at what he needed to do next and was able to follow. It's a very simple, very cheap, reasonable accommodation, and it maintained his employment. During the interview process, you cannot ask discriminatory questions that would help in eliminating a candidate. But what can be asked during that interview is, based on reading the essential job functions, can you perform these tasks with or without a reasonable accommodation? And that's at least the starting point for the conversation. If later that consumer is hired or that employee is hired, then that's when the discussion comes about whether or not the reasonable accommodation, how that would look, how that would work. It is not meant to eliminate a potential employee, but rather to open the door for that conversation. So employment, reasonable accommodations, and interview activities and non-discrimination behaviors by the potential employer is really what the employment component is all about. State and local governments, this is access to your government, your elected officials. This is both your physical structures, workspace, and as well as things such as the websites that we all have and documents that are provided need to be provided to persons with disabilities in a form that is usable by that citizen. And the ADA, and again the Olmstead decision, affirms that governments are to make sure that this is available to consumers. Public accommodations, later on in the slides we'll share with you some visual examples of these things, but really this particular piece does talk a lot about physical accessibility to public facilities. So building access. One example that we can share here locally is Des Moines Public Library and the Justice Department within the last few years had to come to a settlement because the public library was not physically accessible to consumers with mobility needs. So wheelchair accessibility was not available to them. There were steps, and it was taken up with the Justice Department, and it took a decade for that litigation process to finalize through the Justice Department. And this is, again, 1990 was when this was signed into law, and only within the last couple of years did that particular library make itself accessible. So simple things that you've seen: curb cuts, ramps, and I say simple because what it's really done is it's liberated all of us. And I want to give an example, and we'll show a picture later. But curb cuts, when I had little kids and I wanted to take them for a walk, have you ever tried to push a stroller down, over a ledge, over a curb? So it made my life a lot easier when those curb cuts along sidewalks were made, because I could take my child wherever I wanted to go on a walk. Ramps also made my life easier, even with a stroller as a parent. And also I have an aging mother-in-law who has some physical mobility challenges, and walking the ramp is a whole lot easier than taking the steps. Parking spaces, you're familiar with this, about signage and location. One thing about signage that I want to mention too is that it's an accommodation that I think that we in Iowa will have to start talking about too, as we have an aging population. Signage in Florida, for example, has a much bigger font, has a much more visual understanding for persons who are driving who may have some challenges visually. Why Florida? Well, because they have a very high population of persons over the age of 65. So, so they've changed their signage to meet and accommodate the public. Public and private pool access is currently being debated. Specifically, if it's a public pool and I'm a wheelchair user, why can I not use the public pool? An installment of a lift is being argued and debated as to whether or not public facilities should make sure that those are available. But then what about if you go to a hotel that I've purchased a room, and I want to use the pool just like anybody else, should they also not be required to have some sort of lift or an accommodation that allows me to, even a ramp into the pool is sometimes used. So depending on, I mean, obviously you don't put an electric wheelchair into the pool, but those are currently hot topic debates that are occurring. And as of last Friday, Senator Harkin talked about some legislation that's moving that movie theaters for those with visual and auditory disabilities may have some additional required supports within movie theaters so that they can see or hear what's taking place either through some sort of adaptive technology at the movie theater itself. Commercial facilities, think in terms of restaurants, think in terms of places where you might shop. Think in terms of if I had a stroller, or how many times have you maybe pushed a button on the side of a building to get into a door because you're carrying too many groceries, or trying to get in through the door. These accommodations were made because of the ADA, but truly they've made all of our lives a lot simpler. Sizes of aisles within stores and restaurants have been widened in order to ensure consumers who need wider space can get through. Hotel rooms have been retrofitted, I guess, if you will, to make sure that persons who need more space, accessible showers, accessible sinks, those have all been adjusted, or there's been many that have been adjusted so that persons who are using wheelchairs can access those rooms. Most recently, there's a come-and-go settlement here in Iowa to ensure accessible pumps are being distributed throughout the come-and-go franchise or organization. And so you will see probably in the near future modifications to not only the come-and-go stores, but likely other gas stations will need to follow suit based on that settlement. Come-and-go did not admit to any wrongdoing, and it was simply a settlement and no monetary exchange, but they have acknowledged that they want to make these changes for their customers. So those are considered commercial facilities who are making adjustments so that their consumers can access their services. Transportation, ongoing, challenges related to accessible buses in different cities. I know that there was, in D.C. just a few years ago, I think there was a sit-in on some of the buses that took place where not all the buses in the city routes were actually accessible, and those have been changed. Public transit routes where persons with disabilities are employed is a useful way to make a simple, hopefully a simple policy change to get folks where they need to go. And increasing the number of transit supports available in a state or in a state through state or local governments is another. So you've seen paratransit organizations around who have accommodated consumers to get to where they need to go. And a current debate taking place is related to accessible taxi cabs. If it's a public service that others can purchase, is it not considered a commercial facility in a way? And if so, if that's true, then I as a person with a disability should be able to access those taxi cabs just like any other person. So, so there's a discussion and debate and a national debate that you may become apprised of related to accessible taxi cabs. And so these next sets of slides, we'll kind of go back and forth, and we're doing fine on time, it looks like. So, but really these are just visual examples for us to kind of walk you through a little bit. This is an inaccessible sidewalk or curb. And not only think in terms of trying to use a wheelchair or a walker or any other mobility device, crutches for example, but think of even an aging person who has mobility needs. These are fall hazards, and we know that falls are a $19 billion industry in the United States, and they also cause a lot of traumatic brain injuries. So simple prevention planning around sidewalks and curb cuts is a useful tool. Right. So here's some examples of curb cuts and even ways to skid control, if you will. The red patch and the yellow patches there are ways to kind of slow down and so that you don't slip when it's wet. These are accommodations being made in public streets, public sidewalks. Here's an example of accessible ramps. Think about how many times you may have used a ramp instead of the steps. If you needed to get into one of these buildings or into a living environment and you had a mobility challenge, or say you had a stroller with a child in it, which would you probably be more likely to use? And it doesn't have to be fancy. You can make simple modification to facility in order to gain access to a building. And these are some examples of doors, and do you want to talk about the pressure?
Right. So all of these doors are doors that are accessible. Looking at them, it looks like all three of them do have an automatic door opener. But these doors are all accessible for a different reason. I call it the closed fist test. If you can manipulate a door with a closed fist, then and it has the proper amount of pressure to open the door, then it's accessible. I love an automatic door opener. I'm a power shopper, and so when I leave the store loaded down with bags, I always use the automatic door. But if a door is, so the rule about the amount of force that it takes to open a door for it to be accessible is, for an interior door, is 5 pounds of pressure, and that's an easy thing to measure with a fish scale or a luggage scale. And for an exterior door, it's 8 pounds of pressure to open a door. And if a door can be pushed open or pulled open with a closed fist and without exerting more pressure than that, then it's accessible. And let me just kind of say that this is really just meant to give you an overview of these sorts of things. And part of what I did for a living for a number of years was accessibility audits. So if you need some help with accessibility, I would be happy to come and help you out with that. I've done it with a couple of the AAAs, and even looked at a new location before one of the AAAs signed a lease, just to make sure that they were good. So if you need help with that, don't be afraid to ask. It's a friendly ask. So these are all accessible. And so looking at this slide, all of these are good except for the one on the upper right hand. That traditional doorknob cannot be manipulated with a closed fist. But other than that, all of these are accessible door hardware. So looking at these slides, and we didn't really go into a lot of detail about floor space, but this is just kind of, if you look at the picture on the left of the screen with the trash can and the sink. So the sink is good, but in this picture, the towel dispenser is too high from the floor for someone who uses a chair or for someone who's short of stature to reach. It should be a little lower, and even if it were at the right height, it's impeded by the trash cans. So that's a problem. You should keep the floor space in front of these fixtures clear so that someone can make an approach to it. The sink is perfect. It's at the proper height. The pipes underneath, you can see, are insulated with PVC so that it's not a burn or a scrape hazard. And likewise, the toilet is perfect. Those are both very accessible. These pictures, the old-fashioned fountain on the left-hand side is clearly not accessible. The one on the upper right-hand side is accessible. The one at the bottom is accessible. However, the side approach on one side is impeded by the trash can, and so all you would have to do there is relocate the trash can. These are all wonderful, fancy new drinking fountains at a fully accessible park in Springfield, Illinois. Okay, so these pictures, these were literature racks, and the one on the right-hand side is, the top right, is not accessible, although it's mounted at the proper height. It's not accessible because there's furniture in front of it. The one on the left-hand side is not accessible because it's sitting on top of a ledge that's too tall, and there's a plant in front of it, so it can't be approached anyway by someone who is using a wheelchair or who is short in stature. The one on the bottom is properly mounted. So just kind of off the top of my head, the specifications for this is that the bottom rack needs to be no lower than 19 inches from the floor, and the top rack should be no higher than, I want to say 32, but it's not important. If you need more technical assistance with that, I can help you with that.
So the idea behind just showing you these quick snapshots is to show you that, you know, you have consumers who are coming into your facility. What are some real simple things that you might be able to do to make sure it's accessible? And, you know, especially for LifeLong Links locations, you're wanting to provide information, you're going to want to think about how a consumer can get in and access these products whenever they're out there. So a couple quick things that we want, and then we'll wrap up here, is a note about public meetings. As you're planning meetings, as you're planning for consumers to meet with you one-on-one, you certainly should, in a registration process, make sure that you're asking if a consumer who's coming to visit or coming to a meeting or a conference needs an accommodation. But beyond that, in your checklist of things, think about, plan for an interpreter. Do you know where to go to get an interpreter? What other, or a cartographer, I think is what they're called, persons who type on the carts. You know, who locally provides that service or nearby, what's the cost, and start planning that into your budgets in the event you need them. I say you should always plan for a speaker and a mic, because no matter the audience, somebody in that audience may be hard of hearing, and it certainly makes it easier for all of us to hear a speaker who may be low volume speakers. So you should always plan for a speaker and a mic at a public meeting. Think about space on a public transit route. If you're going to rent a space for a meeting, is it on a transit route that has public access for consumers with disabilities? And go ahead and plan for materials in large print and potentially even braille. This oftentimes will come out if a consumer identifies herself as needing an accommodation, but large print, having a few extra handouts in large print, it's an extra expense, but there may very well be a consumer who would benefit from having large print. Leave space at tables for persons using a wheelchair. Don't have a table just all crammed full of chairs. Make sure that there are a few spaces available for consumers who need wheelchairs. It's inviting and it's a warming, and it says, yes, you are welcome at this table. And check that the facility itself is actually accessible before renting. I was just at a hotel earlier this week, and I was shocked to find that it didn't have, now I didn't do the pressure testing or the closed fist test, but it just didn't seem like it was very accessible with plants. There was no button. There was no pressure-sensitive opening mechanism. So hotels are not always accessible. So you'll want to check facilities beforehand to make sure wherever you're having a public meeting is actually accessible. So the final slide here basically is conclusion. We want to make sure that you're aware of person-first language. If you take nothing else away, if you change your language to make sure that it's person-focused versus whatever that disability is focused, then you'll have gone miles in terms of your awareness and in the etiquette world. Respect for other space, leaning on wheelchairs, making sure that there's an accommodation reasonably, and even making space at the table. Ask. Don't assume you know what they need. Get permission beforehand, and once you have permission, assist. The ADA has helped us all. This is an act for all of us, and it's made all of our lives more simple. Reasonable accommodations can be very simple. They do not have to be expensive, and it takes just a little bit of creativity and understanding that person to know what she may need to make a reasonable accommodation available. And there are certainly a lot of other resources, but this is just kind of a starter list for you of where you could go for additional resources. So I think with that, we want to see if there's any questions that were typed in.
Does not look like we're having any questions at this time. So I want to go ahead and thank you all for joining us this morning, and that concludes our presentation. And again, this presentation will be available on our website. Thank you very much.